would have read up until today. So what I have on my notes is Leviticus 19 through Numbers 6. And so that's a lot of ground. I don't know if we can do it all, but and I will do my best to answer questions as they come. So fire away. Totally fine and acceptable. You can ask as many. In fact, I got a really great question last week. I got a great question that I thought of as I was speaking, but and then somebody asked it, and I didn't have a good answer. So I went back and did some research, and you know what? Nobody has a really good answer for it. But I will give you the best answer I can. The question was this. In Leviticus 4:28, in fact, if you want to turn there, you can. There's a rather interesting detail. These are the kinds of things you learn as you read through the Bible when you normally wouldn't be in areas. Like, when's the last time you heard a sermon on Leviticus? Probably not too recently. Yeah, that's true. Pastor Drew preached Leviticus. Okay, I stand corrected. Leviticus, but if had we not been doing this, I doubt that Pastor Drew would have. Okay, 4:28, it talks about the fact that there is if his sin which he has committed comes to his knowledge, then he shall bring as his offering a kid of the goats, a female without blemish. What was the deal with the female being offered as an offering? Because normally it's a male being offered, and so I had a couple people ask me that, and I had no idea. So I did some research, and the best I could find was that these are offerings for the common people. Notice in verse 27, so go back. One of the big rules in reading your Bible is context. You want to find out what is around that and find the context for that verse. And the context is that anyone of the common people sins unintentionally. So we're not talking about priests or kings or somebody really important or wealthy. We're talking about normal people. And so what some people have thrown out there is the possibility that because it's more likely that the male beasts of burden, the male goats, the male animals would have been more valuable due to their strength or for whatever reason, that this would have been a concession saying, look, if you can't afford, like, we understand that you're a common person, you don't have a lot of money, so you can sacrifice one of your females. You don't have to sacrifice one of your males. This is not a boys are better than girls kind of a thing. This is just, it looks like, probably has to do with that. Other than that, I don't know of a really good answer. I looked through all my commentaries that I have. None of them really had an answer to it. This was somebody's, just like one kind of offhanded comment that I found. So if that is acceptable answer, that's about the best I could do. The Bible doesn't really tell us, but we can infer from that that's probably the reason, that this was to the common people. That wasn't allowed for other sacrifices. Okay? Now, let's go to Leviticus 19. As we go to Leviticus, remember that we're talking about this section really starting in verse 19 all the way to verse 27. We really kind of have a couple sections here that we're dealing with in verse, really, according to G. Campbell Morgan, who's a really good commentator. In fact, somebody asked me last week, and I said, if you want the whole chart to the book of Leviticus from Morgan, I can send that to you. I have it scanned in. I'd be glad to send it to you. It's in the public domain now. He deals with this as he calls it a people who are God manifesting in chapters 18 all the way through chapter 22. So he's talking about the fact that they should be separating themselves from evil practices and holiness. In fact, this is a very important. In fact, as you read this, you probably noticed a lot of this is very familiar stuff. We have the laws of sexual morality in chapter 18. Remember where they're going into. Canaan is a very pagan land, and I don't just say pagan because they worship idols. I'm saying pagan because their sexual ethic was extremely vulgar. Okay, these were people who had prostitutes at worship. That was their idea of worship at the temples. They had prostitutes. There was a very sexually promiscuous culture. There were no such thing. In fact, because of this, there were lots of problems, as you can imagine. We talked about their sacrifice to their god Molech. There are all kinds of different names for him, but the Canaanites would often sacrifice their newly born children. Or children of prostitutes that way. It was very terrible. Leviticus chapter 19, let's go there real quick. Leviticus 19, we see the holiness code begin. In 19:1 and 2, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Does this sound familiar? We just had this as a memory verse like 2 weeks ago. I wish my timing had been a little better. We talked about this. The holiness codes are incredibly important. What did we say was the key idea behind holiness? What's the key concept of what does holy mean? Set apart, separate, unique, called out. This idea of something that is different or special. And how many times, notice, let me say it this way. What is the reason that we're called to be holy according to this chapter? Because God is holy. In fact, notice all the times the phrase, I am the Lord your God, repeats in the 2 chapters of Leviticus 19 and 20. I counted verses 3 to 4, verse 10, this is chapter 19, verse 25, 31, 34, 36, and chapters 27 and 24. Phrase, I am the Lord your God. I can say that again, Leviticus 19, 3 and 4, 10, 25, 31, 34, and 36. I mean, look at that. Over and over again, I am the Lord, I am the Lord, I am the Lord. And he's saying this as the reason. It's like saying, not to be blasphemous, like, I'm your dad, obey me. I am your dad. I have the authority to tell you what to do. And God is saying, I am the Lord. This is based in my character. It's based in my person. It is based in my authority. So this is very important in this. What kind of things does the Lord consider to be holy? I made a whole list here in chapter 19. What behavior will be proper for a holy people to do? I'm going to call out some verses, and I want you to be looking through this and see if you can find it. 19:4, what's the act that we're supposed to be doing or not doing that makes us, that is worthy or is fitting for a holy people?
Turn from idols.
No idolatry. Why is idolatry so wicked? Because what? It takes us away from God. Is that what you say? Yeah. But not only that, yes, it takes us away from worshiping God, but I want you to think of it also in these terms. God created us. When we create something else and we worship that, we're making ourselves to be like God. And we are then crafting something that we can worship that we like. This is the same thing people do today when they say, well, I believe in God that's not like your God, but my God is this. And they craft a God in their own image. Right? I've talked to college students who do that all the time. The college students on the Winthrop campus, we used to talk about God to them. Often they would say, oh, well, my God isn't like this. And they do not allow the scripture to speak for itself. Rather, they craft a God in their own image. And that turns them into the creator and God into the creature rather than us being the creature and God being the creator. You see, it's a reversal. So it's not just a simple, oh, idolatry. No. This is a serious sin. How about 19:9? What's another thing that is fitting of holy behavior? You see this one? Okay, provide for the poor. They were not to wholly reap the corners of their fields. So he's like, don't be too efficient. Because there are going to be poor people who need to take care of it. Now, what's interesting is this is not a handout to the poor. There's some things we can learn from this. The poor have to go out and get it. But they were required to leave it. Does anybody recall a story in the Bible? Yes! Ruth, right? Ruth and gleaning. She's gleaning the corners of the fields. This is starting to turn light bulbs on, right? That's why she was able to do that, because she was going to the fields of a certain man named Boaz, and Boaz was a righteous man who obeyed the law. If Boaz had been a miser and it had been one who did not obey the law but decided he was going to use every bit of field that he had, Ruth would never have met him. So obeying the Lord is important. How about verse 11? What are some things that are fitting holy behavior? Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't cheat. Don't profane the name of the Lord. Verse 13 says don't cheat. How about verse 15? Okay, don't judge, or really it's the idea of injustice. Can you read your verse to me real quick? I'm not familiar with the idea of, what is your 19:15? There you go. Yeah, be fair. So the idea of don't be unjust. Don't play favorites. Don't be unjust towards others. How about verse 16? Okay. Talebearer. What's a talebearer? Gossiping. Okay. Amongst all this, do not steal. Do not cheat. Do not deal falsely. Don't worship idols, and don't gossip. Now, I have to say, most people don't put gossip on that same level. But God says, if you're going to be a holy people, you can't go around telling tales. You can't go around gossiping. Because what does gossip do to a community? It rips them apart. It rips them apart, right? It sets people against one another, and it's not good. How about verse 17? Okay? It says, don't do what? Don't hate your brother in your... Now, let me ask you a question. Is this God's law? Absolutely, right? When it comes to the law, have you ever had a policeman, or have you ever had a law, the law, have you ever read the law? Does the law require us to not, like, I'm trying to think how to say this. God cares not only what you do, he cares what you think. God cares what you think in your heart. The law of God is not only about what we do. God says you're not even allowed to hate your brother in your heart. You're not even allowed to hate your brother without him knowing it. Okay, that's against God's law. That is unbecoming of a holy people to hate your brother in your heart. He does something else. There's another heart sin in the Ten Commandments. Do you remember which one it is?
Idolatry.
Okay, yes, but that can be outward.
When Jesus says if you lust after a woman in your heart.
Good. Jesus says that adultery is not only something that's committed by the body, it's also something that's committed in the heart. Can you think of any of the Ten Commandments that are about the heart only? Yes.
Hatred and murder. He equates hatred and murder.
Yeah. That's right. So Jesus makes it, he says, not only should you not kill your brother, but you should not hate him in your heart, because whoever's hate him is still guilty. But there is a heart, soul, good. There's another one. Thank you. I'm sorry. I was way too vague. I'm sorry. My questions are terrible today. My question was that idea is that coveting is against the law, the Ten Commandments. Like, you haven't done anything. You've just wanted something. And God says no. So God cares not only what we do, he cares what we believe. He cares what we think. He cares what's inside of us. That's a very important thing. Verse 18, we are not to bear any grudges. Love your neighbor as yourself. Don't bear any grudges. You see that? That was my, not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of the people. Verse 24. Says, in the fourth year, all the fruit is to be set apart as holy to the Lord. In verse 26, how about this one? What about that?
That was a good question.
You want to ask a question there? Go ahead.
That was one of my questions.
Let's hear it. Yeah. What does that mean? What does it say first?
You must not eat anything with the blood in it. With the blood in it.
Right. So what does that mean? It's important to understand what he's saying first, and then we'll get into what that looked like in practice. Chris?
Because the living blood, it's alive.
Right. So what they're saying is there was a pagan practice at the time. So a lot of these things are direct confrontations against falling in line with the pagan culture around them. Eating things with the blood in it meant eating things raw. Like eating a cow, like taking a cow, killing it, and eating it right there. Okay? Ripping out the raw meat and eating it. This is not against having a steak rare. Okay? That's not what he's saying. The point is that the blood, it is saying you cannot eat raw animal. And there's all kinds of reason for this. What the scriptural, the theological reason behind this is God says the life is in the blood. And that becomes really important because blood becomes a very important concept all throughout the Old Testament and into the New, right? They're required to do all these things, just cut the throat of the animal, to spill the blood on the altar, and all this, you know? It's kind of graphic. It's kind of gory. And then what is Jesus when he dies on the cross? What is the important thing that we're told over and over again? We're saved by the shedding of blood, right? Because without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. So there was, this is a pagan practice. Also, you notice, right coupled with this, you shall not eat anything with the blood, nor shall you practice divination or soothsaying, which is witchcraft. Also, I should say, that a lot of times what they do is they cut open an animal, and they look at its liver. You may not know this, but Babylonians would do this. They look at its liver, and they say, oh, the liver has these spots on it. And then that means there's going to be rain for 3 weeks. You might think, that's insane. Well, we have horoscopes today, and people trust them. You know, we have all kinds of weird stuff. Was that what you were going to, what were you going to comment?
I was going to say one of the other things that they would do is this may equate, they would actually, they cut up an animal's throat, they catch the blood, they would drink it.
Yeah,
They would
that's
also
true.
Look at the blood, and they would also try to use the blood for divination.
Yeah.
Get the discoloration.
Yeah.
They would say, oh, we can see whatever. So
Yeah. So that's a lot of the pagan cultures would drink blood straight. In fact, there's a lot of, we're just going to move on. There's a lot of weird stuff that happened in pagan Canaan. So. There is, I don't know what you're referring to. There's a lot of little things in here. If you can find the verse and tell me, I'd be glad to look at it. There's also a concept. There's a really good book, by the way, which I recommend especially if you're going, teenagers, if you're going to a public college and you take any religion classes, talk to me first. There's a really good book. I think it's by John Oswald, but I could be wrong. It's called The Bible Among the Myths. And what it is, it's a book about comparing the scripture with all the other pagan literature of the time. It's tremendous because what it does is it shows you how different the Bible is. Most college professors you meet will try to downplay the Bible's differences from the pagan culture and would try to say, oh, look, this is just like the world. It's not. It's very different. And in that book, it makes a really interesting point. It talks about some of the laws here. And one of the things that they say, there are some patterns in the laws. And one of them is that the distinction between death and life. And so to boil a kid in its mother's milk is one of the prohibitions in the Bible. And that seems kind of an odd request, not to boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. Why would that be even a law? But to them, it was a thing they would do. And it was confusing the birth and the life. The birth and death. It would be killing a baby in the milk of its mother, which should be giving it life. And so there's all kinds of things that God is about separating. He's about cutting. He's about saying there's holy and unholy. There's clean and unclean. And the pagan cultures were often about mixing things that did not match together. Okay. That's why he said things about not mixing, you're weaving these certain kind of fabrics together. You're to be separate. You're to be different people. You're not to be like the world around you. So there's lots of interesting discussion. We can go into this for a long time, but we're going to move on if that's okay. Any other questions on chapter 19? One last comment in chapter 19, verse 32 and 33 talks about honor. We are to honor those who are old and honor the strangers. Okay? Okay. Chapter 20 talks about penalties for breaking these laws. We talked about Molech last week a little bit, the idea of the babies who were sacrificed to Molech. Molech was a god, as far as I know, who had a hollow stomach, was made of bronze, and had his arms outstretched, and they would burn a fire inside of him, heating him up very hot. And they would take their newborn babies and throw them on the arms of the idol, scalding them, killing them to death. Not unlike what our culture is doing right now with, frankly, with our newborns, or with the babies in utero. Remember the emphasis that has been placed on the seed promise from the very beginning of the Bible. Who remembers what the seed promise is? We talked about this a long time ago. Genesis 3, right? There will come a seed. And so there's a lot of emphasis placed in the Bible on protecting the children, on fostering a home that is good for your children. And this protection, in fact, is so serious here. Again, you shall say to the children of Israel, chapter 20, verse 1, whoever the children of Israel or the strangers who dwell in Israel who gives away his descendants to Molech shall surely be put to death. The phrase, give away his descendants to Molech, is that. Offering up their babies to be burned alive. It's not explicitly stated like that here, but that's what was going on. They also, in the Bible, the phrase is used, they pass through the fire. If you've heard this before, if you've been reading your Bible and it says, you pass your children through the fire, it's the same thing. Okay. They use that euphemism to talk about that horrible, horrible pagan practice. There are also prohibitions against adultery, against homosexuality in this chapter. Again, we're going to see the seriousness of sin over and over again. You notice this phrase, repeating phrase, in verses 9, 10, 11, 13, 14, 15. What do you see a repeating phrase? Anybody notice what I'm pointing to?
Blood shall be put upon him.
Okay, blood shall be put upon him. Basically, put to death, right? Put to death. Romans 6:23 says what? The wages of sin is death. Okay, we tend to, in our culture, play down the seriousness of sin. We say, oh, it's not a big deal. Sin is just like, is not really that big of a deal. You look at the seriousness of sin as laid out in Leviticus, you have a hard time believing that to be true. Also, notice the repeated references to being cut off from the congregation of the children of Israel. Inclusion in the covenant was damaged by sin, so you would be separated from the people. And there's reasons for keeping the law in verses 22 to 26. Go to 22 to 26 for a moment together. This is the purpose for keeping all these holiness codes. He says, "You shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my judgments and perform them, that the land, or so that the land where I am bringing you to dwell, may not vomit you out. And you shall not walk in the statutes of the nations which I am casting out before you, for they commit all these things, and therefore I abhor them. But I have said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has" what? "Separated you from the peoples." There's our key idea again. Holiness, separation. "You shall therefore distinguish," separate, "between clean animals and unclean, between unclean birds and clean. You shall not make yourselves abominable by beast or by bird or by any kind of living thing that creeps on the ground, which I have separated from you as unclean. And you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord your God, am holy, and have separated you from my peoples, that you should be mine." Okay? So the idea is, you are my people, you are not to disobey this, or the land will vomit you out. What happened to Israel and what happened to Judah? They were exiled. They were vomited out of the land for their disobedience to these things. You go all the way forward, you read the prophets, and they always go back to these things. They say, you people were disobedient, you were idolaters, you abandoned God, and now God's going to judge you. And God judges them. And then God brings them back because he's faithful. Right? So we have the faithfulness of God and the judgment that they have experienced. That God says, I'm going to be faithful to you. This is your land forever and ever, but don't disobey or you'll be vomited out of the land. They disobey, they're thrown out of the land, but it's their land forever, so they get to come back. Right? So that's what happens later on, and we see that. Any questions through chapter 20? We're not making very fast progress. We need a what? They needed a timeout. That's a good, yeah. That's exactly right. That's in the Hebrew, by the way. If you read it really carefully, it says that. In Leviticus 21 and 22, we have some priests and priestly items. We deal with the priestly stuff. We have requirements for the priests. They're not to have any, get this, okay. This is very interesting. Did you notice this? No baldness. I'm not going to look at some of you. No baldness. Sorry, Pastor Randy. No baldness allowed. No, they were not even allowed to have any defects. No blindness, no lameness. What do you make of that? Thomas? Sure. Sure. Well, you can perform your job if you're bald, I hope. I think, yeah.
Just the culture's view of those kind of things as lesser than.
It's possible. It's possible. Yeah, I think it has to do. Those are all very possible. I think probably the best, most biblical answer to that question, that hard question, is that you have God is very particular in the image he is portraying for the people, because these are pictures of what's to come in Christ, right? And so there cannot be anything that would distract from the perfect picture of the priest going before God for the people and presenting the offering. Okay, so if he's got a bald head, then maybe they start to think you have to have a bald head. And he's like, no, that's not important. You can't, that is not the issue. The issue is what's happening. So that's probably what's going on. But I think you start connecting the dots. What does Jesus spend so much time doing in the New Testament? He walks around, and what does he constantly do? Now, he doesn't heal people of baldness, but he heals the blind and the lame. Go ahead, Tara.
Well, my version, in 21:5, it says, they shall not make bald patches on their head. So to me, it seems like it's like a man-made, like you couldn't shave your head bald.
That's very,
Versus it natural.
yeah, that's probably true. I don't know. I don't know if that means that they can't be bald or they can't make it bald. I think it could be either one. I think the idea, but you look at even they're lame, they can't help if they're blind. They can't help if they have any. But you're right. The idea of them marking themselves as like tattooing is also another thing that's outlawed as well. From these kind of marking the body or marking or offending or even shaving the sides of their heads. Yes.
Yeah, because mine is kind of like somebody says, priests must not shave their heads or shave off the edges of their beards.
Right.
Why not even their beards?
So they couldn't shave the edges of their beards. Yeah. What does your note say?
It says that these were superstitious marks of grief.
Okay. So in what are the marks of grief again? Shaving of the edges. Yeah, because they would. Okay, yeah, okay. That makes sense. That's probably a better. Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah, Tony?
In college, they said that one of the possibilities for this too is if you look at the Egyptian priests,
Yeah.
rounded beards,
Yeah.
typically would have patches.
The priests they would have. Yeah, you're right. They would. The Egyptian priests they came from. Remember, they come from Egypt. They're going into Canaan. So you've got their culture was very different. Yes, sir.
Going back to your common context,
Yeah.
all the verses above that are about you can't defile yourself with someone who's died. So I think that comment's right.
Yeah.
And
With the context, he's saying you can't defile. Whatever the case, there are very, very specific orders about how you are to present yourself and how you are to be. And it's not come as you are. Okay? And it's not just be whatever you want to be or be all you can be. It is you be what God says and you do what God says. And there are some people who just aren't going to be able to do it. And all this is kind of reversed as you see in the New Testament. Jesus comes in and he starts healing people of their blindness and healing people of their lameness, healing people of their leprosy and their spots, and they can't, and they're going to present themselves before the priests and all these things. I think that's very intentional, the way Jesus goes about healing those different illnesses. There's as far as the bald stuff, that's interesting. I don't really know. You're probably right. It's probably more of a making your bald than necessarily being bald. Good news, right? For you gentlemen. But this is Old Testament law. This is not New Testament church. Remember that? There's a difference between Israel and the church. This is not our constitution for Harvest Baptist. So if you're going to take offering, you can't, have to have this stuff. That's not how we do things around here. This is a new dispensation. We're in a different time. But these are important for us to understand what God takes seriously. The idea of being holy, the idea of being separate, being different. And in chapter 22, verse 20, whatever has a defect, you shall not offer, for it shall not be acceptable. Okay, even their offerings cannot have any defects at all. The picture has to be there. They have to see the perfect lamb, the perfect offering, and that's what Jesus is going to fulfill with the perfect Lamb of God. Those that are blind or broken or maimed, verse 22, or have an ulcer or eczema or scabs, you shall not offer to the Lord. Verse 24, you shall not offer to the Lord what is bruised or crushed or torn and cut. And you shall not make any offering of them in your land, nor from the foreigner's hand. Okay, so we have all these offerings that are not accepted in verses 17 all the way through 33. Let's keep going briefly here. There's all chart of, the whole thing about feasts in chapter 23 all the way down through, we have Sabbath, Passovers, first fruits, weeks, trumpets, Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Booths. All these different feasts and how they are organized and when they happen, and they all have purposes. Not going to get into that right now, but if you want a chart, there's an excellent chart in the ESV Study Bible. I have it reproduced right here. If you'd like to see it or like to take a look at it, I'd be glad to show it to you or send it to you. Lots of great charts out there. You can always Google. I'm sure they have some good ones online as well. A couple notes on chapter 24. And that is the tabernacle lamps. I just want to say really briefly here, there's a lot of effort put into the light that goes in the tabernacle. And Jesus says, I am the light of the world. There's, again, emphasis there on vision and seeing. One last note I want to make here, and then I'll take any more questions. On chapter 24, verse 17, an oft-quoted and familiar passage. Maybe as you're reading this resonated with you. Look at verse 17. Whoever kills any man shall surely be put to death. Whoever kills, that means any person, not just a man. It could be a woman too. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good, animal for animal. If a man causes disfigurement of his neighbor, as he has done, shall it be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has caused disfigurement of a man, so it shall be done to him. And whoever kills an animal shall restore it. Whoever kills a man shall be put to death. You shall have the same law for a stranger and one for your own country, for I am the Lord your God. Okay, the eye for the eye, tooth for the tooth is often misunderstood and misquoted. Here's the point. It is a limiting principle. Okay, a limiting principle. And this will help you understand what's going on in this. When he says an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that means if I go over to Pat and we're fighting and I punch him and I knock his eye out, he can't have me put to death. The worst he can exact from me is that I also have my eye removed as punishment for what I did to him. He cannot do anything more than that. Does that make sense? It's a limiting principle. It's not a maximal principle. It's not saying, oh, now I get to put his eye out. It's that I cannot do anything more in exacting justice from him than what he took from me. Does that make that seems to make sense? Yes, sir. Equal punishment.
One thing people forget is this was national judicial law.
Right.
This doesn't mean you knock my eye out, I get to put your eye out.
No, it was
This
taken.
means
Yeah.
The judge now has parameters
Correct.
on what he can and cannot exact.
Correct.
It's not a personal vendetta.
Correct. It's not street justice or hill justice, as they call it. This is limiting factor of what is allowable for retribution. You cannot go after somebody. This is why I personally have a problem with some people who go after people and try to sue them for all they're worth. I personally have a moral issue with sometimes people do that, because what happens is they're taking this and they're not obeying the spirit of the law here of there is a limiting factor. You have to understand that you should not be going after people with that kind of mindset. There's an equal justice kind of thing that happens here, where you should not be trying to exact punishment from someone more than what you receive. Any more questions on? I mean, we have so much to cover, but so little time, so I'm going to just stop there. Yes. Yeah, they had local judges. Yeah, there were judges. There were people who were in charge of the way it was done in the ancient Israel was much more localized. So at this time they're still traveling. Once they go into the land, you see this, for example, in Ruth when they have the judges at the gate of the city. So often they would come to the gate of the city to the elders, and there would be people there who would make judgments. If it was a very serious issue, it could go to the king, but most judgments were handled on a very local level. And this was a good limiting principle for the justice that would be doled out in this manner. Yeah, so right. If you were to back into my car, it doesn't mean I get to take a baseball bat and knock out your taillight. It just means that I ask you to repay and do my car. I don't get to possess your car now that you backed into mine. You just have to repair mine. It's that kind of a principle, a limiting principle of retribution. Okay, God's concerned about his people getting along in harmony with one another. I just want to make one last note, and then we'll be done. All right? That is, I keep saying one last note. I forgot to mention this earlier. How do we get our names for the Old Testament books? Why do we call it Leviticus and Numbers? When I was doing Numbers, I thought, I bet most people have never thought about this. Why is it called Numbers? Did Moses name it Numbers? The people are numbered, right? Yeah. So in the Latin version of this book, they put numeri, which means numbers, right? So we use the word numbers, even though the Hebrews don't call it numbers. No, the Hebrew people call it in the wilderness. Because that's what they do typically is they take the first word of the Hebrew in the book, the first word of Hebrew in the book, and that's the title. So Genesis is not called Genesis in Hebrew because that's a Latin word, means beginnings. But in Hebrew, it's Bereshith, which is in the beginning. So Bereshith is what the Hebrews or the Jewish people call Genesis. They call Exodus, they call it Shemot for short, but the full word is, let's see here, Volea Shemot, which means, and these are the words. These are the words. That's the beginning of Exodus. Leviticus is called, and he called. That's literally like if you were to talk to a Jewish person, you would call it, I think it's Vayikra or something like that. Vayikra. And he called. And Numbers is in the wilderness, and Deuteronomy is called, these are the words. These are the words. So it's the same as, no, this is the name. I'm sorry. Exodus is not these are the words. This is the name. I spelled that wrong. So Exodus is this is the name, or these are the names. And Deuteronomy, these are the words. So that's the Hebrew names for the books, is they take the first words of the book. So it'd be like calling Tale of Two Cities the best of times, the worst of times. The title of the book, right? There you go. Lord, thank you so much for the time we've had together tonight. I pray you would help us to appreciate your word even more after we study it. I pray you'd help everyone to stay focused on